Thank you for being here. Beautiful Sunday morning. Please join me in opening up Scripture in Nehemiah chapter 12. I think we are over the hump, finally. There are names, but not as many, and I'll take that. It's not the entire section of names, just a small portion. But also in the sense of we only have one more chapter, so chapter 12 and 13, and we're done. Time flies. I think it's going to be about a little bit less than a year, about 10 months or so, which is a good amount of time for a book like this. Time flies. So Nehemiah chapter 12, today we will cover verses 27 to verse 43. And before we get started reading, just a little context. Now, as I've mentioned, we've exhausted the list of names, even though we do have some names in this section, but this part is all about the dedication of the wall. So essentially, what we will look at is a ceremony to celebrate the completion of the wall. So let's see exactly how that is going to work out. Again, starting from verse 27. Now, at the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, they sought out Levites in all their places to bring them to Jerusalem to celebrate the dedication with gladness, both with thanksgiving and singing, with cymbals and stringed instruments and harps. And the sons of the singers gathered together from the countryside around Jerusalem, from the villages of the Netophathites, from the house of Gilgal, from the fields of Geba, from Asmaveth. For the singers had built themselves villages all around Jerusalem. Then the priests and Levites purified themselves and purified the people, the gates, and the wall. So I brought the leaders of Judah up on the wall and appointed 2 large thanksgiving choirs. One went to the right hand on the wall towards the refuse gate. After them went Hoshea and half of the leaders of Judah, and Azariah, Ezra, Meshullam, Judah, Benjamin, Shemaiah, Jeremiah, and some of the priests' sons with trumpets. Zechariah, the son of Jonathan, the son of Shemaiah, the son of Mattaniah, the son of Micaiah, the son of Zakur, the son of Asaph, and his brethren, Shemaiah, Azrael, Milalai, Gilalai, May, Nathaniel, Judah, and Hanani, with the musical instruments of David, the man of God. And Ezra the scribe went before them by the fountain gate in front of them. They went up the stairs of the city of David on the stairway of the wall beyond the house of David as far as the water gate eastward. The other thanksgiving choir went the opposite way, and I was behind them with half of the people on the wall, going past the tower of the ovens as far as the broad wall, and above the gate of Ephraim, above the old gate, above the fish gate, the tower of Hananel, the tower of 100, as far as the sheep gate, and they stopped by the gate of the prison. So the 2 thanksgiving choirs stood in the house of God. Likewise, I and the half of the rulers with me, and the priests Eliakim, Messiah, Benjamin, Micaiah, Elonai, Zechariah, and Hananiah, with trumpets also Messiah, Shemaiah, Eleazar, Uzi, Jehohanan, Malchijah, Elam, and Ezer. The singers sang loudly, and Jezrahiah, the director. Also that day they offered great sacrifices and rejoiced, for God had made them rejoice with great joy. The women and the children also rejoiced, so that the joy of Jerusalem was heard afar off. So again, this is a story of the dedication of the temple. It is a celebration of this finished product that started a while back. From a chronological book perspective, the wall was finished in chapter 6, and now here we are in chapter 12, and now there is a celebration. We'll touch upon a little bit later on as far as why there was this gap, but for now, it's important for us to understand that they were actually following somewhat of a standard. So if you go all the way back to the time when the first temple was built, something similar happened. When Solomon finished the first temple, they celebrated, and they had certain elements of that celebration that was very much similar to what we have here. They had musicians, obviously they had the Levites and the priests there, and certain sacrifices and offerings. So they're pretty much mimicking what had already occurred. Now in Ezra, if you go all the way back to Ezra, the book prior to this, we know that in that story, the temple was built. And in chapter 6 of Ezra, they had a celebration or a dedication of that newly rebuilt temple, the second temple. And here we have a celebration of all of the project being complete. So not only is this a celebration of the wall, but also it's a celebration of the temple, because then it was a celebration, but everything was not complete. So here it is an overall celebration of everything that has been accomplished roughly for 90 to 100 years since they had originally come back from exile. And here in the beginning of the text that we just read, there's a reference of the gathering up of Levites. As we know, the Levites were spread around, but they were these particular people that God had divided or separated for the purpose of his personal service, the service of the temple. There was a lot of religious obligations. The priests came out of the tribe of Levites, so there were Levites. And within this tribe, there were also some that were musicians. So that was their forte. That was their primary obligation. Again, all of them served God in some fashion, but a few of them focused on musical instruments. So this is sort of like the precursor of worship bands, if you will, right? I actually preached a long time ago at a church that called their worship team the Levites. I thought that was kind of pretentious. I was like, can I be called Moses? If we're just utilizing these names. But anyways, that was kind of the point I think that they were trying to make, right? Since the Levites, some of their obligation was musical, then their worship team was also called the Levites. And within this context of celebration, it's interesting that prior to actually celebrating and dedicating and consecrating the wall and the temple, they took the time to prepare for that. How did they prepare for this celebration? Let's look again at verse 30. Then the priests and the Levites purified themselves and purified the people, the gates, and the wall. Now, we don't know exactly how this worked. If you just kind of look at it superficially, it almost seems like they scrubbed everyone down. There was some type of ritual performed, possibly something even close to what we do when we baptize people. So that is a possibility. Most likely this had to do with sacrifices and offerings. We do have a reference pertaining to that. So it is likely that they had sin offerings and other types of offerings at this point in time. And that was what it's meant here by this purification of the people, of these religious leaders and of the actual physical walls and gates. Basically, they wanted to prep them so that this celebration, this consecration, would have been accepted by God, because then they were ready for it. They were pure. They were sanctified for that purpose. Now we go to verse 31, and verse 31 is actually pretty important when we talk about chronology. Now, I mentioned this a couple of minutes ago. It seems odd. It seemed odd to me, and maybe it seems odd to you. The walls were finished in chapter 6, and now we are in chapter 12. So a long time has passed, right? As far as our efforts in studying Nehemiah, it's been a while since the walls were finished. So why the delay? Why wait so long to dedicate the temple? Actually, there was not that big of a wait. From a historical, chronological calendar perspective, it was actually done right after. How do we know this? Look at how verse 31 started. So I brought the leaders of Judah up on the wall. Now, the question that we have to ask is, who is I? I is Nehemiah. And what is interesting about this is that this is the first time the first person is being utilized since chapter 7. So in chapter 7, or until chapter 7, most of the things that were happening, it was Nehemiah narrating this story and documenting it in his personal memoirs. And then we have somewhat of a parenthesis from halfway through chapter 7 to the first half of chapter 12. And now we have a bunch of information that was most likely external from Nehemiah's personal memoirs. And now there is a continuation of what he wrote down. And I mentioned this, I alluded to this idea, I think, last week. It is very likely, if not probable, that this book, much like many other historical books in the Bible, that it was a compilation of different resources, and then after the fact, it was all put together and they tried to fit in chronologies, but there are parentheses, right? So if we're just considering the chronology of events from Nehemiah's perspective, what he was dealing with in the first part of chapter 7, namely right after the temple was built, and now in the second part of chapter 12, it happened right away. But again, we have a thematic gap because a bunch of other information was included because the compilers, the editors of this historical account wanted to fit certain things in within the story. And this does not affect at all inspiration. It does not affect at all revelation. We know that all of that encompasses God utilizing people in very practical ways. People who are writing down stories or writing letters to individuals for personal reasons, for social reasons, for religious reasons. And that was absolutely normal. Yet God was supervising this in a spiritual and abnormal, supernatural way. So again, this follows exactly the trend of other books in the Bible. But all of that to say is, they did it right away. As soon as the walls were rebuilt, they celebrated this accomplishment with this dedication and consecration of the wall. Now, it's also neat or interesting for us to take a look at what exactly was happening as they were celebrating. We know that part of it had to do with singing, with utilizing musical instruments. We've seen references of this with utilizing, obviously, religious leaders, the Levites, and other rulers. We saw this list of people that were, quote unquote, invited for this purpose. So everybody who was anybody was part of this. But there was also a procession of sorts. I do have an image that I want to show you here. It's a map similar to something that we've already seen before, but this one is a little bit better because it's somewhat of a maquette, 3D fashion. What we have referenced in this text is that Nehemiah, he essentially divided the people up into two groups, two processions, two choirs, if you will. And we don't know exactly where they initially met, but most likely X marks the spot. That is more or less where they met based on other references, even though it's not listed here or it's not stated exactly where they met. But let me read to you a couple of verses just for us to get situated as far as what was happening here. So on verse 31 it says, "So I brought the leaders of Judah up on the wall." Now does that seem odd to you? Brought them up on the wall. Why would he bring them up on the wall? Were they, rock climbing? Why? Why don't you just walk around the wall inside the walls in the city, outside of it? Actually, if you picture the Great Wall of China, this is more or less what is being stated here. From an elevated perspective, it just looks like a wall, but if you go close up, it's actually almost like a street. The walls were so thick that people could actually walk on top of the wall. And that makes sense because it's strategic, right? You need these walls to be thick enough so that they were strong and people could actually be on top of the wall to see if enemies were coming or to somehow defend it from above. So this was pretty standard. Even till this day, if you go to Jerusalem, and you walk through, the sections where they still have the old walls, you will see that they are thick enough for you to walk on top of it. I think I walked on top of a portion of the wall, a smaller portion. But again, this was standard. This was not abnormal. So Nehemiah, essentially, he was meeting these people and they were going up on top of the wall. And appointed, here I'm continuing on verse 31, 2 large thanksgiving choirs. One went to the right hand on the wall towards the refuse gate. So again, it is my estimation that they started in the X, and now he is talking about the choir, the initial choir, illustrated by these blue arrows it's going first south towards the refuse gate. Where was the refuse gate? Do you remember forever ago that we talked about each individual gate? Now the temple is on the uppermost part of the structure. Where would you put your dump? As far away from the temple as possible, right? So they started in the X, they went south, and that's where the refuse gate is, and then went up towards the temple. That's basically what is being illustrated here or mentioned here. So verse 32, after them went Hoshea and the half of the leaders of Judah, and Azariah, Ezra, Meshullam, Judah, Benjamin, Shemaiah, Jeremiah, and some of the priests, sons with trumpets, Zechariah, the son of Jonathan, the son of Shemaiah, the son of Mattaniah, the son of Micaiah, the son of Zakur, the son of Asaph, and his brothers, Shemaiah, Azarel, Melaliah, Gilalai, Maai, Nathaniel, Judah, Hananiah, with the musical instruments of David, the man of God, and Ezra the scribe. Now, we have mentions of different Ezras, but whenever we hear Ezra the scribe, we know who we are talking about. We are talking about this very important character in this story. So it is likely that this group of people, again, they were split into 2 choirs. We're now covering this first one illustrated by these blue arrows, and since Ezra is being mentioned here, it is likely that he was leading this initial procession that is going south and then north towards the temple. So he is leading this half of the choir. But then if we go on, we see who is leading the other one. 37, by the fountain gate in front of them, they went up the stairs of the city of David on the stairway on the wall beyond the house of David as far as the water gate eastward. Verse 38, the other thanksgiving choir went the opposite way, and I was behind them. Again, who is I? I is Nehemiah. So now we have a pretty good sense of what is happening here. Ezra is leading this procession, this choir, to the right that goes south initially and then north. And Nehemiah is leading this other procession, this other choir that goes straight up. And where do they meet? They meet at the temple. And this is where the final celebration happens. So let me read through so we can kind of gather that thought. Where did I leave off? I'll start again from verse 38. The other thanksgiving choir went the opposite way, and I was behind them with half of the people on the wall, going past the tower of the ovens as far as the broad wall, and above the gate of Ephraim, above the old gate, above the fish gates, the tower of Hananel, the tower of 100, and as far as the sheep gate, and they stopped by the gate of the prisons. So verse 40, so the two thanksgiving choirs stood in the house of God. Where is the house of God? The house of God is the temple. So that's where it ended. That's where they met. Likewise, I and the half of the rulers with me, and the priests, and Eliakim, Messiah, Benjamin, Micaiah, Eloni, Zechariah, Hananiah with trumpets. Also Messiah, Shemaiah, Eleazar, Uzi, Johanan, Malchijah, Elam, Ezer, the singers sang loudly with Jezrohiah, the director. So now we know what is happening. But then we have an interesting note. Verse 43. Look at what is stated here on verse 43. Also, that day they offered great sacrifices. Again, this is part of the dedication. This is part of the consecration. And rejoiced, for God had made them rejoice with great joy. The women and the children also rejoiced, so that the joy of Jerusalem was heard afar off. So, once again, this was a celebration of sorts, right? This was something that was done, sort of like an inauguration of this building project. Now they're actually going to utilize it for the purposes that God had prescribed. But much like any other celebration or ceremony, the main purpose of you gathering everybody up to celebrate something or to make a ceremony, it's for you to have these people almost as witnesses. It is a testimony of a fact. So let me name you some ceremonies that are similar to this. Wedding ceremonies. Could you marry somebody, just the two of you, in the justice of peace? You can. It's legal, and there's no religious reason as to why you can't do that. Perfectly fine, perfectly legitimate, perfectly legal. But why do we usually have bigger celebrations? Why do we invite a bunch of people and then the bride and the groom, they're there trying to, and I'm sure most of you have been through that if you have been through a wedding, your own, and you're trying to narrow down the list of people who are going to be invited, right? And usually there's a deal where, well, you know, we can't invite everyone because they charge you by the plate, by the head. So you got to narrow down the really important people, because if you invite everyone, then it's going to be very expensive. You're going to have to cancel your honeymoon because you're going to be in debt. But all of that to say, you are inviting people to that ceremony, essentially because now they are witnesses of what is happening. You could do it on your own. You could do it very low-key. It can just be you and a couple other people, but you choose to do it in a way that it becomes a testimony of what is happening. Same thing goes to funerals. Isn't that true? It is a ceremony that celebrates a life, but also it serves as a witness to others about who that person is or was. Graduations. Now that's the epitome of witnesses, right? Graduations, you go there and God bless your soul. It is an important part of your life and you should be proud of that. But please do not invite me to a graduation. I think the last major graduation that I went to, and it was a long time ago, I think it was at UCLA. And we were sitting in one of the stadiums, the smaller ones, not the Rose Bowl, that's not even on the campus. But there was no covering. And we got sunburned, scorched, just to hear one little name within a sea of names that lasted like, half a second. Now, I was a witness to that. But did I really need to be a witness to that? There were thousands of people who could vouch for that person and say, hey, you graduated, I saw you getting your diploma, now, go ahead and be a productive member of society. But again, you invite people and you celebrate, so that becomes a testimony. And there are many other things that we do in that fashion. So here, it's sort of like the same thing. It was a celebration, but actually it became a testimony to others. How do we know this? Because it's literally listed here or stated here. So that the joy of Jerusalem was heard afar off. So part of the reason to celebrate in this grand fashion, it was that the people surrounding this region would take notice of what was happening. God did this. And they were celebrating God. They were dedicating this wall to God. And everybody around this region took notice of that. They were witnesses of that. It was a testimony to that very important thing that occurred. But do you know what else is interesting here? Again, I mentioned, and it's stated, what they utilized for the purposes of this celebration. They utilized people, obviously, in this procession. So there was singing, there was the playing of instruments. So, you could think of this being pretty loud. And sacrifices and offerings, so maybe like the smoke is coming up and you can see it from far off. But quite literally, as far as what is being documented here, that is not what people noticed. Look at what people noticed, and let me read that again. So that the joy of Jerusalem was heard from far off. It wasn't the singing of Jerusalem. It wasn't the instruments of Jerusalem. It wasn't the smoke pillars due to the sacrifice of Jerusalem. It was the joy of Jerusalem was noticed or heard from far off. To me, that is interesting. It is thought-provoking. First of all, because we know how this came to be. how did this joy that could be heard from far away, how did they experience this? How was this birthed? How did this come to be? Again, verse 43. Also that day they offered great sacrifices and rejoiced, for God had made them rejoice. So we know who birthed, who gave, who instigated, who manufactured this joy. It wasn't an inward joy. It wasn't a joy that was fabricated from within. It was a joy given by the Lord. So we know who made the joy and who gave the joy. But we also know the means to how this joy came to be. The process. How did it come to be? Through a dedication, through a consecration of the wall and the temple and everything that was accomplished here. Now, what exactly is a dedication? Basically, what they were doing here is that they were honoring God by saying, God, this is yours. Now, do you think God, when he heard this, and again, they were loud, so he must have heard all the singing and all the instruments and definitely smelled the sweet aroma of the sacrifices. It reached the heavens. Do you think God was touched by this dedication in the sense of, wow, are you really giving me that wall? I am shocked. Have you ever received a gift that was beyond your expectations? Little old me, Almighty God, and you're giving me this wall. You're dedicating this wall. You are consecrating. While I am, no. I'm sure God was glad. He was very happy with their posture. I'm sure he was content, but I doubt that it was going through his mind, wow, what a surprise, you're giving something to me. Why? It was already his. It belonged to him. And there was no doubt about that. So the dedication, or a dedication, when it comes to what we are talking about here, has less to do with the choice of giving something to God, and much more with the acknowledgement that that thing already belongs to him. It belonged to him all along. So it's not a choice, it's not a decision that I'm making. I'm saying, God, you know what? I love this little bottle of water. It is mine. I purchased it or stole it from somewhere. But it is mine. Yet, I want to be nice. And in thanksgiving, because I appreciate you so much, I am going to give it to you. Look at that. How awesome I am. What a great decision I've made. Something that is mine, and now I'm giving it to you. I'm dedicating this water to you. It's not how it works. How dedications truly work when it comes to dedicating something to God, it's the acknowledgement, God, this is awesome water. This quenches my thirst. I literally cannot survive without this. I will die. I use this all the time. And in certain ways, it seems like it's mine because, again, I can buy it or borrow it or open the faucet and take it. But truly, even though I'm able to utilize it, even though it serves a very practical function in my life almost on a daily basis, it's never really been mine. It's always been yours. And here I am acknowledging this fact by dedicating this to you, by consecrating this to you. Now, why are we defining these variables so much? I'm just going to leave that there. Why am I going on and on about what it means to dedicate something? What it means to consecrate something to God? It's because of the joy factor here. Again, what was the vehicle? We know that the joy came from God. God gave them joy. This joy served as a witness. Beyond the instruments, beyond the singing, beyond the noise, beyond the smoke, the people saw joy. They heard joy. God-given joy. How did that joy come to be? They were dedicating something to God. In other words, they were acknowledging that that belonged to Him. And through that vehicle, they achieved joy. What does that say when we lack joy? Can we make an equation of sorts? Think about the things that sometimes you have a hard time feeling joy about. Now, bear in mind, most of these things you probably were happy about at some point in time. But then for whatever reason, life happens and you lose joy. No longer are you content with that. No longer do you appreciate that. No longer is that something positive. You just kind of go through the motions and you try to just bear through it, but there's no joy. And I believe that part of the reason why we lack joy in many facets of our lives, it's because we very seldom acknowledge who that thing or who that person really belongs to. Do you see how I'm trying to connect the dots here? And the illustrations are obvious. Sometimes we lack joy in our relationships, marriages. And I think partly it's because that we think it is our own. We take possession of that because it is something that we do on a daily basis. We use on a daily basis. We participate in that on a daily basis. And it's almost, again, like it's mine. And then we lose joy. And I believe part of the equation for us to regain that joy is for us to stop and really think about who that marriage belongs to. And maybe even often rededicate that relationship. God, it is yours. It's not mine. It is yours. That relationship is yours. That bond is yours. You created that. You maintain that. You are the one that is most interested in that being successful. It is yours. That job that does not seem like a blessing anymore. Why? Because it's your job. Because you have to deal with it. Because you're the one working. But what if every once in a while you just stop and think about that as it is yours, Lord. It's not mine. I'm a part of it. I'm doing some of the work. But this is yours. I am not acknowledging that this is not all about me. It is only through you that I'm able to function in a certain way. Through this profession, through this job, through these obligations.
We even lose joy in our personal possessions. Have you ever dealt with that? I'm sure you have. Something that you attain, purchase, that you are gifted, and it seems like great at first. Thereafter, not that big of a blessing. Not that big a deal. It is yours, God. Yeah, I use it. Sometimes I misuse it. That's another story. But it is yours. And it seems like oversimplistic. I understand that. It does. And I'm still trying to wrap my head around how exactly to do that, but I think it is an important principle that we see here. They built the wall. The wall would function a very practical purpose in their society. In many regards, it was their wall. And up until this point, we saw a lot of fighting, a lot of bickering. People didn't really want to move into the wall and the city. Not to mention the animosity from the surrounding peoples. And until here, we don't see or hear much of the joy. And only after the wall was dedicated to God in an acknowledgement of who it really belonged to, do we see this supernatural joy coming from above to the point where it can be noticed from far off. Have you ever been that joyous? Where people just notice? You're just gleaming? This is what was happening here. So again, even though it may seem overly simplistic, and it may not be the silver bullet that is going to end all of your issues pertaining to lack of joy. What do you have to lose? Try it out. Try it out. In particular and very specific areas of your life, when you notice that you lack joy, just say, God, this is yours. I am dedicating this to you. And see what happens. See what comes out of that. I hope and I trust that joy can be experienced through that. Amen.